Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram, and so you can support me on Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, Subscribe Star, and make sure to check out my Substack as well. I'm again joined by Logos for episode 27 of the Grindset stream and episode 27 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. All right, so we're in the end zone. We're almost done with 2007. We're not quite done yet, but almost. Neocameralism and the escalator of mass-archy. Mentions Moldbug, December 20th, 2007. It's very hard to show that any new form of government is superior to that practice now. It is even harder to show that any form of government is superior to any practice ever. Nevertheless, unless these problems are not just hard but actually unsolvable, innovation in the form of government is possible. It is worth noting that government in history has ever encouraged its subjects to believe that it could be innovated away, which is rather straightforward explanation of the fact that few have ever believed it possible, which does not make the proposition true, but does suggest one way in which it could be true. Certainly, the very idea of innovation in government should not frighten you. If it does, there is no point at all in talking about government. This is conservatism to the point of mental disorder. I simply cannot contend with it, and I refuse to try. If you cannot set yourself outside your own beliefs and prejudices, you are not capable of normal civilized discourse. Today's post, despite its precious neologistic title, is about one of my favorite subjects here at UR, democracy. Most people are conservatives with respect to democracy. They like it, they want to conserve it, they consider it sacred and holy and good. And perhaps, of course, it is. I mean, even Churchill, hardly history's picture of a Democrat, said democracy is the worst possible form of government except for all the others. Of course, Churchill also drank a fifth of scotch every day. Perhaps he was drunk. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps he was lying. Perhaps he was both wrong and lying. Perhaps he was so lying, so wrong, and so drunk that he actually turned out to be right. Perhaps he was an Armenian. Perhaps. As Jimmy Cliff put it, in The Harder They Come, who can know this thing? So why wouldn't we take a minute or two and actually think about it? Google Analytics, which I certainly trust no more than I trust Churchill, informs me that the average time per page on UR is 4 minutes, which means either that our average reader is a faster reader than me, or that a lot of people are going, and then skimming, or both. Surprising as it may seem, there's actually is an easy way to show that any new form of government Y is superior to today's brand X. Simply present a convincing picture of Y, then present an egregious escalator by which Y devolves into X. An egregious escalator is a sequence of historical events, each of which is in some way egregious, demented, fraudulent, retarded, barbaric, predatory, psychopathic, or otherwise nasty, but which one thing turns into the other. Since no number of wrongs can make it right, X must be more egregious than Y, which makes Y superior to X. Of course, we are making large, broad judgments here. It is impossible to entirely eliminate all forms of nastiness from every human affair. On the other hand, if you can't just agree that NS and communism were nasty, you must get water on the brain every time it rains. Any fool can keep an open mind. You, our readers, do not strike me as a non-judgmental people. Also, the procedure above is a bit too direct for me. To avoid pressing political hot buttons and to make the argument more modular, I prefer to show that Y can devolve into Z and Z equivalent to X. So we'll start by showing that neocameralism can devolve through a series of nasty steps into a system called mass-archy. Mass-archy is, of course, RZ, but we will not spoil our suspense by considering it further. Note that the steps in an egregious escalator need not be inevitable or even plausible. They just need to be undesirable, i.e. egregious. The only axiomatic assumption we have made so far is that nastiness obeys a total order. If B is more nasty than A and C is more nasty than B, C must be even more nasty than A. If you differ on this, we have different definitions of nasty, to say the least. And I must ask you to take with you your nasty and someone else click. So, for example, if an egregious step is absolutely physically impossible, we don't care at all. We can just introduce aliens into our, Gedenken experiment. They can fly on their big silver frisbees and, okay, there you go. Knock stuff up. let's start with my ideal world, the world of thousands, probably even tens of thousands of Neocameralist city-states and mini-states or neo-states. The organizations which own and operate these neo-states are for-profit sovereign corporations or sov-corps. For the moment, let's assume a one-to-one mapping between sov-corps and neo-state. Let's pin down the Neocameralist dramatis persona by identifying the people who work for sov-corps as agents, the people or organizations which collectively own it as its subscribers, and the people who live in its neo-state as its residents. Secondary corporations, which it sponsors, are its sov-corps. Nonprofit organizations, which operate with its permission, are its suborgs. Illegal organizations are ill-orgs. Residents fit into two classes, patron and dependent. Dependents are not legally responsible and are under the authority of their patrons. There's no dependent without a patron, although sov-corps or suborgs may act as patrons. The Neocameralist state is not a charitable organization, but it has no reason not to tolerate a genuine apolitical charity. Since patrons generally act in place of their dependents, we need not consider the latter from a political perspective. So any politically relevant person, P, with respect to any sov-corps S, can be marked or unmarked with 3 bits of a state: subscriber, agent, patron. For example, it is generally unhealthy to have a large quantity of patron-subscriber overlap. When a sov-corps patrons and subscribers are the same people, the conflict of interest is inherent. Actions which harm most or all subscribers may turn out to benefit some or many patrons. Do you want to go there? You don't, but perhaps we'll see what happens if you do. Every patch of land on the planet has a primary owner, which is its sov-corps. Typically, these owners will be large, impersonal corporations. Okay, Logos, how can you have a large impersonal corporation and also be a tiny city-state?
I think he's talking about the intrinsic bureaucracy of the corporation, not how much land it occupies. So the city-state's tiny, but the organizational structure of the corporation is large.
Well, but if that's the case, then it's going to own multiple city-states, and the political divisions are meaningless.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you can have, in a single skyscraper, you can have a corporation with like 50 different departments and divisions.
Yeah, sure. Okay. We call them sov-corps because they're sovereign. You are a sovereign if you have the power to render any plausible attack on your primary property by any other sovereign power unprofitable. In other words, you maintain a general deterrence. Sovereignty is a flat peer-to-peer relationship by definition. The concept of hierarchical sovereignty is a contradiction in terms. More on this in a minute. The business of a sov-corps is to make money by deterring aggression. Since human aggression is a serious problem, preventing it should be a good business. Moreover, the existence of unprofitable governments in your vicinity is a serious case of concern because unprofitable governments tend to have strange decision structures and do weird, dangerous things. Nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, is only one small class of deterrent designs. To deter is to render predictably unprofitable. Predictably unprofitable violence is irrational. Irrational violence is certainly not unheard of, but it is much, much rarer than you think. Most of the violence in the world today is quite rational, in my humble opinion. General deterrence is a complex topic which deserves its own post. For the moment, assume that every square inch of the planet's surface is formally owned by some sov-corps that no one disagrees on the borders, and the deterrence between sov-corps is absolute. This does not solve the problem of constructing a stable sov-corps. The central problem of governance is the old Latin riddle, who guards the guardians? The joint stock corporate design solves the central problem by entrusting guardianship in the collective decisions of the corporation's owners, voting not by head but by percentage of profit received. Oh, that's worked so well in real life, Logos, hasn't it?
Right?
That works so good. Now, again, this was right before the market crash of 2000. Oh, this is December, so I think the 2007 crash had already begun. So, yeah, worked. All of this, like, you can read libertarians too. When everything before 2007 is just this bizarre fever dream fantasy where they act like the corporations are omnipotent and then all of a sudden it hits the fan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's crazy. The joint stock model is hundreds of years old. It is as proven can be. Anyone who questions its potency in producing profit and annihilating waste and graft might as well believe in the international Jewish conspiracy while they're at it. I mean, anyone can be a world socialist. Isn't it much cooler to be an NS? Did you ever know anyone who got kicked out of high school for believing in the UN? However, in the sovereign context, the corporate joint stock ownership and decision structure faces serious challenges which do not exist for a conventional secondary corporation. In the conventional secondary corporation, the control of the owners is unchallenged and unchallengeable, at least as long as the sovereign's rule of corporate law is functioning properly. The corporation is incorporated under the oversight of a sovereign, protector, or sponsor. This is what makes it a secondary corporation. The sponsor of a secondary corporation manages the relationship between owners and directors and managers. The ideal sponsor does not tolerate any hanky-panky in these relationships, and nor does it insert its own weird ideas about how the company ought to be run. The owners are in absolute control of the directors are in absolute control of the managers, period. Well, I mean, it's going to be a little hard with the Ring of Finargle. You got to admit, Logos.
Yeah, and it just doesn't seem to play out that way in real life, does it?
No, it doesn't. Womp womp. In a properly sponsored corporation, whatever the details of its organizational structure, authority flows in one direction. Does not go around and around in a big tangle. Of course it does, Logos. Wow. Oh man. There you go. It all goes to the CEO, Logos. No division, no politics, no drama. Straight to the top. It does not reverse its course like a tidal river or a broken sewage valve. It certainly does not ferment in big lagoons like industrial pig waste. Wow. All I can say is corporations did a really good job with their PR for people to actually believe this.
Yeah.
No, just in a properly sponsored corporation, but in any healthy corporation, primary, secondary power flows down and profit flows up, and this flow never stops in either direction. Think of the two paths as xylem and phloem, arteries and veins, water and sewers, etc., etc. As Bernard Bailyn points out in one of his footnotes, classical political thought concurred in considering imperial in imperium, i.e. internal sub-authorities powerful enough to resist or even control the center, a political solicism. In case you are not too skeptical to have ever worked in a cube, you are probably aware that imperial in imperium is a solicism in a PowerPointia as well. One small difficulty, however, is that imperial in imperium means basically the same thing as separation of powers. Internal management in modern Western corporations is pretty good. Well, there you go. And then 2008 happens, Logos. How's that? At least by the standards of modern government, imperial in imperium is non-existent. It should not be confused with the normal practice of internal accounting, which does not in any way conflict with an absolute central authority in a single set of books. In a secondary corporation, external management, the top two layers, shareholder to director and director to executive, are and must be regulated or at least overseen by the sovereign sponsor. As one might expect, external management these days is not as healthy as its internal counterpart. Boards are infested with inside directors. Voting is intentionally obfuscated. CEOs and CFOs often manage to cheat shareholders. While I'm hardly an expert in the subject, from my casual standpoint, it doesn't look like American corporate law and governance deserves any grade above a C. Perhaps some commenters will beg to differ. Still, the U.S. was almost certainly the most efficient, least corrupt sovereign sponsor in the world today. Wall Street has one regulatory mechanism which actually works and forces managers to act in the interest of its investors. This is the takeover. One can separate sponsors into those which generally allow takeovers and those which generally don't. As a very broad statement, the latter are not to be trusted. And America is the original home of the takeover. He's referring to hostile takeovers, right, Logos?
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, the board can vote to oust a CEO and put a new one in.
Okay. In the context of sov-corps, the idea of a takeover starts to sound suspiciously like violence. Oh, it's just the old chimp, young chimp, right, Logos? Schrodinger's chimp.
That's right.
Which we thought we had eradicated permanently for good. I mean, as the background question to his entire political theory, how do we eliminate violence? As if it's something, okay, not reduce it, right? Sensible politics is about reducing it. But like to actually eliminate it, well, I mean, how can you be so brain damaged to think that's actually possible?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like other people have believed that before and tried and failed. So, oh well. Now, if he'd said like reduce violence, that'd be different. But he says eliminate. So there we go. Or eradicate it, I should say, right here. If you suspect that you may not have gotten rid of it, you probably haven't. So it's worth taking another look at the fascinating problem of a sovereign corporate governance. I mean, Logos, we already have one of sov-corps. It's called the East India Company. And it does a lot of stuff that Moldbug wouldn't like.
Right.
Or maybe he would. I don't know.
He probably would, to be honest.
He probably would, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, remember, he said his whole position is corporate fascism. So there you go. Briefly, there are two options for sov-corps governance on Neocameralist Patchwork Planet. One is cross-listing and the other is crypto governance. In cross-listing, sov-corps list on each other's secondary exchanges, taking great care to select only the most reputable sponsors and demanding a backdoor in which they can switch sponsors at the slightest hint of weirdness. Okay, this is something that I keep on thinking about, and he hasn't mentioned it yet or even addressed it. If these are all basically corporations, I mean, given that, to quote Peter Thiel, the goal is monopoly, the goal is to amalgamate. And I think it was the Rockefellers who said that some of the amalgamation is like the future. How would we not end up with a one world government run by a corporation? Like that, they're not gonna. The logic of the corporate structure is to consolidate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if these are all mini corps all over the world, they're all gonna eventually consolidate.
Especially if you notice that like people in sov-corps A are moving to sov-corps B and vice versa. People moving when the wind blows a certain way is eating the profits. So if they can merge, like say Hulu and Disney, and just make one sov-corps, so no matter where you move, you're kind of under the same joint management, and they're profiting from you either way. That's kind of how it starts, and then it just keeps going until you're screwed.
Yeah. Briefly, there are two options of cross-listing can probably be made to work. However, it is dangerous as a single line of defense. For any ideal sov-corps, it should be combined with some degree of crypto governance. Crypto governance is any system of corporate government in which all formal decisions are endorsed and verified cryptographically. A sponsor can still be useful for crypto governance, but it's not required. Shareholders in a crypto-governed corporation known as subscribers use private keys to sign their contributions to its governance. They may or may not be anonymous depending on the corporation's rules. If you are an American, have you ever wondered what the letters SA or similar, which you see all the time in the names of European companies, mean? They mean anonymous society. If this strikes you as weird, it shouldn't. Unfortunately, in the wonderful real world of today, anything even remotely resembling anonymous crypto governance is known as money laundering by our friends in Washington. Therefore, I do not recommend you run out and try it. If you do, you certainly should not use real money. The first rule of successful reactionary: never annoy authority. The neat thing about cryptographic government, which is actually much easier than it sounds, we're taking a few thousand lines of code max, is that it can be connected directly to the sov-corps' second line of defense, cryptographically controlled military. That's such a ridiculous idea that you're going to have like everybody's guns in the armory with like a cryptographic electronic chip or something. Like how would you even do that, Logos?
The other problem too is what happens if you get a hold of somebody's key.
Mm-hmm.
So let's suppose you swipe a key from one of the board members or multiple of the board members, and you use their key to cryptographically put in information into the system. Well, since everything received is anonymous, you don't even know who in the board has been compromised. You can do a lot of damage before they even figure out who's been compromised, who's an imposter, whose access should be revoked, so on and so on and so on. Like if you know whose access should be revoked, it's not anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just strange.
Cryptographic weapons control in the form of permissive action links is already used for the world's most powerful weapons. I think he means nuclear weapons. However, there's nothing in principle preventing it from being extended down to small arms, for example, with a radio action code transmitter over a mesh network. Military formations loyal to the CEO will find that their weapons work. Rebel formations will find that theirs don't. That's such a childish view. Like, what? Hackers could just hack in. Or you could just make, black market guns that don't have these chips.
Exactly. The black market's the big thing. I mean, crypto makes it really hard to hack stuff because you don't even know which guns you're hacking into because everything's all random. But the black market definitely. Like rebels aren't obviously going to rebel with the arms that won't work.
No. Well, and not only that, given that this is all electronic, EMP done. Then what's the CEO going to do? None of his stuff works.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, these tech bros don't think about EMPs.
Tech bros aren't really smart when it comes to the real world. They should just stay in cyberspace. The outcome is obvious. Moreover, the Neocameralist state has no incentive to deal kindly with traitors, so there is no way for an attacker to repeatedly probe the system's weakness. The one difficulty with cryptographic weapons control is that if it fails and develops into a simple military rule, if the authorization keys are kept anywhere near the weapons, weapon holders can gather unlocked or non-cryptographic weapons secretly and use them to arrest the key holders, for example, the directors of the sov-corps. The solution is simple: keep the sov-corps directors or whoever has ultimate control of the highest grade military keys outside the sov-corps neo-state. Even if the CEO himself rebels, along with all his subordinates, any form of loyalty to the directors can defeat them. The result is internal military stability. The result does depend on the planetary Neocameralist patchwork. If this degrades, perhaps thanks to mergers and acquisitions, into a few giant mega sov-corps, it will be at risk. How does the Neocameralist patchwork avoid this horrendous fate? All right, look. Okay. What did I just bring up a few minutes ago?
Yep, there we go.
Let's see if he does it. One way is for the subscriber covenants to prohibit chain states or suspicious combinations of shares that might result in a chain state. However, since in a crypto-governed state that the subscribers hold absolute power, they cannot be forced to obey these covenants. They can sell every share in the sov-corps to Google if they like, leading to a terrifying new era of permanent Googocracy. Yikes, me not like so much. The solution here is the patrons. The key is that the less monopoly power a sov-corps holds, the more it has to fear competition, and the lower its primary rents will be. In other words, if its patrons do not have the practical option of switching to a competitor, it will be possible to extract more money from him. Let's see. In other words, if a patron does not have the practical option of switching to a competitor, okay, a rational monopoly neo-state still has no motivation to personally abuse its patrons. Oh, of course, Logos. I mean, I don't know, keeping labor costs down. This is so stupid.
Yep.
I mean, we all know that the best way to keep the cost of business down is to cut the cost of labor.
Well, it says next time it would always tax that it always rather tax than abuse. Well, I don't know. I know a good many people that think taxation is theft. So
I know.
Abuse.
So what's that?
Yeah.
And why not just forget the abuse altogether? And once you do this, all you have is a Baroque tax structure, which is abusive in itself. So this will go as well. Of course, if some patron is causing a security problem, abuse is assured. I mean, I just think abuse is assured because the model of this whole system is to keep labor costs down.
Well, that, and the entire point is it's like, if people have another state to go to, then like he's missed the entire point here. Like, he's given lip service to it, but he's not really considering it. The entire point here is that if a sov-corps starts treating its citizens badly, it can move to another one. And that's what's supposed to keep pressure on it to just do revenue maximizing taxes and keep the environment nice, basically.
Yep.
But if these things start merging, the entire point is there will be nowhere for these people to go. They don't have to worry about competition, and so they can abuse people all they like.
Yeah. Therefore, just as patrons prefer a neo-state which maintains the rule of law and does not make sudden, unexpected demands on their person, they will prefer a neo-state that requires its subscriber to show they are an individual private investor who are not residents. If the sov-corps fails to enforce this restriction, it will be treated like any neo-state in which a breach of legality occurs: instant real estate price collapse. No, not every resident needs to flee with children in suitcase for the sov-corps subscribers to taste the pain. There is pretty much no way to spin a collapse in the price of your only capital asset as management success. I mean, we have, in the international order today, pariah states like North Korea. I guess that's when he wrote this, that included North Korea, probably Iran. You can do it. You can still do it. I mean, again, the black market. I mean, the libertarians are always the ones telling us, Logos, well, actually, regulations don't work. There's a black market for everything. Okay, if there's a black market for everything, what the heck, Logos?
Yeah, I think the only response you'd make that as something like, well, North Korea has to spend a lot of effort keeping its citizens in its country. And my response would be, yeah, that's the point. Like, once you have a big enough monopoly, you can just remove the ability for citizens to flee anywhere.
Yep.
And then you can extract more from them, because you're not really constrained by the classical mechanisms of firm competition. You're a monopoly, and you own the government.
Yep. This covenant effectively acts as a poison pill defense, preventing acquisitions friendly or hostile. A truly hostile attacker who uses fronts to purchase shares will find that the value of the purchased business is much lower than the price paid, because the acquisition is illegal by the neo-state's own internal law. So the mechanism requires no external enforcement. It works by deterrence like any other effective defense. All right, Logos, what do you have?
What? Let's scroll back a second. I think I'm missing something.
Yeah.
Therefore, prefer neutral. Okay. Require subscribers to show they are individual private investors who are not residents. Residents of what? If the sov-corps fails to enforce this. Here's the problem. Not residents of what? If it's residents of the state they're investing in, that's one thing. But what if you have residents of state B that invest in state A? You've got residents of state A that invest in state B. It's these investors jointly that merge the two states, forming the monopoly, right? Everybody is going to be a resident of somewhere. So every subscriber is going to be a resident of somewhere. And if you're worried about different states merging, then anywhere a subscriber lives that subscribes to your state could be a target of the merger of your state. There's no way of getting around it. So the only way to solve this problem is going to be to make stocks illegal everywhere. Like, you'd have to abolish the stock corporation to actually make this not a live option, which you can't do.
No. Womp womp. The cost of the covenant is that since it eliminates the takeover as a guarantee of effective governance, it requires active participation of the subscribers in corporate control. Of course, the subscribers will probably find it desirable to nominate independent proxies. Aside from the takeovers, proxy voting does not really work in any corporate governance system in the world today. But I feel this just reflects incompetent regulation on the part of sponsors. It could work, it should work, and in absent of takeover subscribers, we will have an incentive to make it work. So we have constructed what I think is a reasonably convincing stable sov-corps. Well, I mean, if you're a computer programmer like Moldbug, it's reasonably convincing, but not to us.
Yeah, it just sounds like Judge Dredd in 5 years.
And by extension, a stable design for planetary patchwork of sov-corps. There are still a few little loopholes we have not covered, but hopefully the commenters can describe them. Okay, so this is the problem. Whether you're a libertarian, an anarchist, like my friend Keith Preston, or Moldbug, to have lots of little political entities rather than one big one is kind of a power vacuum. And history shows us that over time, there is a strong pull to consolidate. So the question is, how do you deal with that? And nobody seems to really have a good answer. The anarchists, the libertarians, and Moldbug don't have any good answer as to how to prevent that. They just kind of wave their hands around and act like it's self-evident. It's bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, the meme, of course, is always, true communism has never been tried. But I don't think there's anywhere that meme is more apparent than true anarchism has never been tried. Human beings, whatever your view of human beings, whether it's Adam and Eve or evolution, We weren't born in a government cradle. We made governments. We made empires. They tend to be one of those successful things. So, while the communists can say, well, we almost had communism, but here are these existing structures that stopped us. It's the exact opposite problem with this kind of quasi-anarchism. There are no inherent structures in history that favor governments, and yet we ended up with them anyway. So that's going to require a very special explanation that they need to give.
Which nobody can give.
Right.
Now let's break out one of our neo-states, call it New Frisco, and try to make it into a mass-archy, whatever that is. The first step is simple. The CEO of New Frisco's sov-corps, manages to find some way to hack the director's keys. Okay, I mentioned the keys, so there we go. As a result, she becomes an absolute monarch, not CEO, but Queen of New Frisco. It is her. Frisco. That's a really weird sentence. Frisco, it is her. What is that supposed to communicate?
That her and the corporation are now synonymous.
So, like, I am the state kind of thing.
Yeah, I am the law.
Okay, well, say that, Moldbug. She unifies ownership and control in a single person. No leader in the English-speaking tradition has been this powerful since Elizabeth I, at least. If the Queen is acting in her own best interest, she will end the experiment here. She is now the sole subscriber of her own sov-corps. She is also the sole director. The original subscribers have been thoroughly pwned by her egregious hack. Whatever that may be, perhaps the aliens helped. They now have no role to play. They can crawl up in a ball and cry. Therefore, the Queen's best decision is to sell New Frisco to a new set of subscribers. Using the usual IPO process. As part of any such IPO, she will almost certainly have to resign. She is not exactly what you call trustworthy. Who would hire her? I wouldn't hire her, and hopefully this new sov-corps, which to honor the utter blandness of government in the Neocameralist era, we'll call NextCorps, will come up with a new set of encryption routines. Wait, why would she sell it? Right? Why is that her? No, furthermore, he just gave us this elaborate argument that if you break the rules, you're gonna be under interdict by all the other sov-corps. So first of all, who's the Queen gonna sell to? And second of all, she's not incentivized to sell.
Exactly. Yep.
What?
That's why he says, however, she does not do this. So let's see what happens.
This is because she's acting in her own best financial interest. This is because she is an ironclad bitch and she loves power, and no amount of cash can substitute in her own personal opinion for the sheer awesomeness of being Queen of New Frisco. I mean, it's not like she's short of money anyway. However, the Queen fails to notice something else, which is that the encryption keys that control her military are compromised. Just as she hacked the directors, her generals hack her. They cannot obtain the keys, but they can break the system so that no keys are needed to operate the weapons. Well, wait a minute. If you can do that, then what's the point of the keys in the first place?
Well, this whole thing is trying to say the system falls apart because the keys are faulty, basically. And what we're trying to say is if this Queen hacks things because keys are faulty, then anybody who would not like the Queen would hack the Queen because she's got the same faulty keys. But I mean, historically speaking, this kind of takeover would happen due to a cooperative coup.
Yeah.
So it's like, while the military could hack her, they're usually probably going to back her. So okay, what happens if the military is backing the Queen? So they could do this, but they don't want to because they have an agreement.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's difficult to see her displacing the CEO without the army's backing, right?
Exactly.
Well, no other neo-state in the world will allow the sale of mere weapons to a failed neo-state whose military control framework has been broken down. The generals of New Frisco have all the weapons they needed for the moment. Hello, Logos, the black market. I thought the libertarians were telling us it's the black market for everything.
Why wouldn't they allow it? It's not their problem. I mean, if the states can make more profit selling money to this failed state, why wouldn't they do it? I mean, name a country that America doesn't sell guns to.
I know.
We'll sell guns to anybody.
I know. Well, I mean, in the 80s, Ronald Reagan sold guns to the Khmer Rouge to fight Vietnam.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, anybody. Let's see. They certainly have enough to arrest the Queen and have her shot at once, which they do. New Frisco's getting ugly. The generals are now in command. New Frisco becomes a classical military despotism. Probably at this point, it becomes difficult for patrons to leave New Frisco. It certainly becomes difficult for them to leave with all their assets. In theory, it is possible for normal social existence and economic activity to continue in a basically normal way under a classical military despotism. Portugal under Salazar, Spain under Franco, Mexico and the Porfiriato are all good examples. Military rule or militarchy is still one of the closest government forms to neocameralism, and if there was such a thing as a stable militarchy, it would be quite satisfactory. Okay, that can only make sense if the only thing he cares about is hierarchical top-down control, because the incentives of a military are like the opposite of a corporation. They're not for profit. They don't issue shares. Basically, the military works on socialism, right? I mean, everybody has the same rations, the same haircut, right?
Yeah.
What is he talking about?
Well, you're right. That is all he cares about is top-down control. Remember, his whole shtick is we eliminate violence by making it ironclad clear who's in charge.
Okay, but here's the thing, though. The military, again, I use the term socialism here loosely, but the military has far more in common with socialism than it does with a for-profit corporation.
Which is why he thinks that the military structure isn't stable, right? However, militarchy isn't stable. So he's going to make an argument why this won't work.
Right. The problem is that the generals can only rule for so long as the soldiers are willing to follow them. Well, that's the thing for any government whatsoever.
Well, exactly.
So, okay, that's not an objection to military dictatorship. Also, there is the question of which generals. See, the real danger here is that once you have one military coup, you've paved the way for more military coups because other people think they have a shot now.
Right.
That's the real problem.
Yep.
We saw this with Rome, the Roman Empire, and we see this also in third world countries, like in Africa. The difference between militarchy and neocameralism is that the militarchy is informal. Well, the military's informal, Logos. Stop the presses.
Well, it's informal in the sense that you don't know who is in charge if the current leader dies, for example.
But neocameralism by definition is informal because we have Schrodinger's chimp.
Well, yeah, basically. I mean, formalism is impossible, but if you're under the mistaken belief that formalism is possible, right? If you can just mandate who's in charge if the CEO resigns, then...
The only way to know who the soldiers will follow is to have a coup and see what happens. Ambiguity of power raises its ugly, ugly head. If they are acting in their best interest, therefore, the generals will do what the queen should have done and get out while the getting is good. They should construct a new subscriber structure by issuing shares, probably prorated by rank to the entire military. The military can sell those shares probably gradually over time, and neocameralism reasserts itself. However, they do not do this. Perhaps they are ignorant or pig-headed or something. These conditions have certainly been noted in military men, so the egregiousness continues. The generals therefore take the second best option and convert their militarchy into an oligarchy. Okay, real quick, Logos. This is, he's basically using Plato's Republic as a template. I think it's book 8 where Plato talks about the decline of the ideal society. So you go from the ideal society to the democracy, the rule of the warriors, which then goes to the oligarchy, which is the rule of the wealthy. And wait for it. We're probably going to see democracy come up right after oligarchy. And so it's that's what I'm calling it. I think he's going down the Plato route. What do you think?
Yeah, but what I think is hilarious is if oligarchy is the rule of the wealthy, neocameralism started as the rule of the wealthy.
Well, no. But you see, oligarchy is the informal rule of the wealthy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right.
See, cameralism is the formal rule of the wealthy. Duh.
Well, this is the thing that's bugging me about all this, right? We can talk about all this theoretically, but real brass tacks, the real issue with all this is, okay, who gets the initial shares of these sov-corps? These sov-corps first pop up. Who gets shares? With what currency? Who has the currency? How do they use the currency to buy the shares? At every step of this analysis, it's all informal because everything is ultimately arbitrary. Right? How many shares are made? Arbitrary. How many are going to be sold? Arbitrary. What are you going to sell them for? Which currencies are you going to allow to buy them or not? Arbitrary. Which people at that point in time have the currency to buy these newfangled, sov-corps shares? Accident of history. Right? There's nothing formal about any of this, and all of this could be changed. If I see neocameralism popping up, and some guy's like, yeah, I'm about to buy a bunch of shares of a sov-corps, you could kill the guy, steal his money, use his money to buy the shares,
Yep.
right? So the original sin of this oligarchy is going to be that it's the very same kind of informal that he's about to accuse an oligarchy of being.
Yep. The present government of China is an excellent example of an oligarchy. An oligarchy is an informal system of government in which a militarchy has been brought in to include all influential individuals in the state. When soldiers govern, the distinction between soldiers and administrators disappear. The oligarchic system of sovereignty works by convincing potential leaders that they are more likely to succeed by staying in the tent rather than outside of it. Any one-party state is essentially an oligarchy. In its modern form, at least, an oligarchy tends to take the form of a hierarchical pyramid with not one leader but a committee, council, or parliament at the top. Like all governments, it distributes its profits in the form of power and money. Some people like power, some prefer money. You certainly cannot buy the former with the latter, at least. It's never a simple transaction. Everyone in an oligarchy is always jockeying for position. The informal personal conflicts within an oligarchy can often be poisonous, but at least they are political only in the sense of office politics. That is, they do not involve the banner-waving tropes of mass politics. So oligarchies, too, can be quite satisfactory places to live and work. All of today's governments, whether proto-neocameralist such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and Dubai, or post-democratic as in the US and Europe, contain significant oligarchic elements. That is, their decisions are affected by people who often have no formal decision-making position or whose formal position inadequately describes their real influence. For example, the Western bureaucratic system operates under the delusion that there is some distinction between political and nonpartisan government. The latter can therefore be concluded by permanent officials who are unaffected by elections, as well as by NGOs, which are not even formally part of the state. As long as the system can sustain the illusion that the political officials are all making all the real decisions and the nonpartisan ones are only carrying out technical directives, the present Western model combines some of the political advantages of mass-archy with some of the administrative advantages of oligarchy. Mass-archy becomes necessary because the oligarchy is unstable. Once we enter the oligarchic phase, I think you meant to say it becomes clear to everyone near New Frisco that its power base, which would be its subscriber base if formerly had not broken down, is expanding in a rapid and uncontrolled speed. What you see, I mean, the subscribers are not the basis of the power of a political organization. It's its military.
Yeah.
This is stupid. And it's not even the power of the basis of the power of modern day corporations. It's their ability to buy out the government to create monopolistic conditions for them.
Yeah.
Okay. Therefore, the patrons start to get in on the action. They are, after all, right there, and they are not more noble than anyone else. I'll just add this. For libertarians and Moldbug, and I guess you could say normie conservatives, for all of these economic geniuses who know how to run the economy and how the world works, they don't seem to be very good at making money, unlike Google or Facebook.
Is Facebook good at making money? I thought Facebook was chronically unprofitable, kind of like Twitter.
Well, maybe now, but like the point is, the megacorps have no problem, dominating the economy, whereas these dime a dozen, economics experts who are like libertarian or normie cons just can't seem to make two coins stick together.
Maybe. I don't know too much about that.
Mass-archy is any system of government in which those who hold power are confirmed by the allegiance of the masses, or at least, there we go, democracy. So this is basically Plato, or at least some segment of them. Political power is always hierarchical, and political leaders and factions always gain power by building a critical mass of supporters or clients. Wait a minute. Okay. So in a mass-archy, you get support from clients. How is that any different than a neocameralist state getting support from its subscribers?
Sorry, how is what different?
The client versus the subscriber. How are they meaningfully different?
Well, a subscriber wants what's best for the long-term interest of a corporation because it depends on the corporation for dividends.
Mm-hmm.
The client can rob the corporation, move elsewhere like a horde of locusts. So they want just to be able to raid the treasury short term and move on.
The rise of mass-archy under the Gracchi marked the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. Yeah, well, okay, I have to... Okay, no, what marked the end of the Roman Republic was the centralization of property in the hands of a few patrician class. The Gracchi tried to reverse it and failed.
Mm-hmm.
Because, once you have an urban proletariat of unemployed soldiers, well, there goes the Republic. And an interesting question is why, considering the ineffectiveness of unprofessional mobs in combat against professional soldiers, especially in the modern military era, but the profession of soldiers hardly knew a popular mass, is it all relevant? Why does it matter who has the biggest mob? Doesn't it just boil down to who has more divisions? It doesn't, and the reason it doesn't is that soldiers don't just follow their generals. They tend to have personal connections with one mob, faction, or another. Thus, the size of the mob indicates the number of divisions who are likely to agree with it. Soldiers, like everyone else, want to be on the winning team, so the head count of the mob becomes a shelling point. Mass-archy is best defined as a system of government in which the opinions of residents are captured and controlled by one or more political factions. One easy way to capture a resident's opinion is to dangle the possibility of plunder generated by political cooperation, especially when said plunder is distributed in the form of power and wealth, for example, in the form of government jobs, opinion, responding to great human capacity for flexible self-interest will swing in its favor. The inevitable consequences of mass-archy, therefore, is a strange, systematic distortion of popular opinion in which residents, perhaps at this point, we had better call them citizens, adopt not those theories of government and society which are most accurate, but those which are more likely to win power. These tend to be those theories which tend toward expanding the state, increasing its revenue and authority, etc. In a mass-archy, expansive theories of the state tend to prevail over contractive theories through the natural process of political entrepreneurship. If you're a leading supporter of an expansive theory of government and your faction gains power, you're likely to get a job out of it. If your faction holds contractive theories and it wins, they're more likely to be layoffs. Thus, if the probability of victory is equal, you are always better off joining the expansive forces. This expansive force tends to win, another good reason to join them. Remarkable as this may sound, mass-archies demand that every adult citizen of a state support some political faction and maintain some theory of government. You can eat cheese, you can even be a connoisseur of cheese without knowing anything about how cheese is made, having some opinion of who should and should not be making your cheese, etc., etc. In a mass-archy, everyone is expected to be a cheesemeister. If they fail at this task, the result is bad cheese. Fortunately, most of today's mass-archies do not actually inflict government cheese on most of their citizens, but the fate is not difficult to imagine. It is only natural that in a mass-archy, the most influential individuals become those who influence public opinion. The course of future decisions in a mass-archy will be set by its journalists and professors. Those who wish to change the world, exercise power, will aspire most to these roles. The aphorism that academic politics is so bitter because the stakes are so small is an easy misapprehension of the situation. Actually, academic politics is the most important thing in the world. Wrong. I don't know. Seriously, how do you get this brain-damaged idea that, university professors, unless they're scientists, in which case I would agree that they do rule the world, but he's coming at it from the cultural angle. The humanities. I mean, the humanities were literally being gutted. I was going to school at this time, and those people are not the ones that run the world.
Right, the ones that run the world are the ones that pick from the dwindling humanities people some darlings to be cultural light bulbs, more or less. It's this view that the cathedral is totally organic and not controlled, and it's just a bunch of private individuals making dumb fads. But no, it's like we know, it's the CIA and a bunch of other people controlling what's popular.
Yep. Actually, academic politics is the most important thing in the world. Okay. In a policy debates in a mass-archy, there's only one card that trumps popular opinion is science. That is correct. And this card is not infrequently played. Mass-archy corrupts science just as it corrupts popular opinion by favoring the victory of views, which lead to more expansive programs of government, regardless of their accuracy. Mass-archies also seem to develop large extra-governmental agencies, which are not formally part of the state, but nonetheless are influential in setting policy. In the early phases of a mass-archy, formal administrators can exercise enormous amounts of power. However, this attracts the jealousy of other administrators. The compromise is often to adapt a formal process by which decisions are made. The result of the process is typically determined by extra-governmental players, which succeed in presenting themselves as impartial experts. Wait a minute. Well, here he seems to understand that these people pick the winners, but then he'll act like, oh, it's spontaneous.
Yep.
So he knows better. The modern mass-archy senses public opinion largely through the mechanism of polling, random sampling lists residents' opinions. Before polling was technically practical, it relied on the more primitive system of periodic elections. Officials produced by these elections still exist and are often still relevantly influential. However, for obvious reasons, they are only in a position to influence policy for such a time as polls confirm their popularity. In future, periodically elected politicians in a mass-archy will probably become completely symbolic, as they largely have in the EU. Polling is quite sufficient for a stable mass-archy and much less subject to strange feedback effects. The state simply has to be able to track the polls and not deviate too far from them, where its security will be at risk. Let's see. Fortunately, since the state controls its citizens' education and mass-archy, as its risk of losing control over government public opinion is minimal, mass-archies can thus be relatively stable for long periods of time. However, they tend to deteriorate over time due to the permanent leftward bias that favors expansive or overly contractive theories of government. And if the state does not lose control over the mass mind, an accident which can happen due to the extremely low and continually degenerating quality of government that mass-archy provides, it can degenerate into the only worst form of government, brute-archy. A brute-archy is a mass-archy in which public opinion is not really molded by education, but actually compelled by brute force. In this extremely nasty and unstable structure, political opinion turns against the state, and its system of indoctrination is not sufficient to turn it back. The residents are permanently disenchanted. However, because violence prevents them from expressing their actual opinion on the nature of the state, residents of a brutarchy can never be absolutely sure that most other residents of the brutarchy agree with them. Their collective opinion remains unknown and cannot be verified. It is thus of no military significance. The security forces, which typically include a substantial plainclothes contingent, remain in power. When this situation breaks down, one recalls the East German crowds chanting "Wir sind das Volk," the brutarchy fails. Note the considerable difference between a militarchy and a brutarchy. It is easy to confuse these forms, but it is also unforgivable. A militarchy whose power is unquestionably rooted in the barrel of a gun need not bother itself with propaganda. Well, then no such government exists.
Yes.
Because all military dictatorships use propaganda. Did you think Franco didn't use propaganda?
Yeah, every government uses propaganda.
It need not care what its residents think, as the Duke of Wellington put it. Okay, whatever. Note that mitraille means grape shot. A machine gun is a little mitrailleuse, a later invention, but one which I'm sure would have delighted the Duke even more. A brutarchy knows that if its soldiers ever learn that its residents despise it, they will refuse to shoot into the mob and instead overthrow the regime. Thus, the difference between militarchy and brutarchy is the loyalty of the army. In a militarchy, the army's loyalty is to the regime, the leader, the junta, or even just the military itself. In a brutarchy, the army is loyal to the people, a cult which your average militarchy works very, very hard to discourage. Brutarchy is nasty not only because it does nasty things, but also because it is very difficult for anyone in a brutarchy, even the nominal leader or leaders, to diffuse and rewind back toward a healthy neocameralist model. The trope in which more expensive theories of the state tend to defeat less expensive ones does not lose its power with the transition from mass-archy to brutocracy. These theories tend to simply detach from reality, and the mental world of brutarchy is a world of lies and delusions, even more than in a mass-archy. Returning to stable government without some kind of violent upheaval becomes almost impossible. Well, okay, Moldbug admits the point that we made earlier, Logos, that either no state or small states tend to give way to states that have an expansive agenda. And he doesn't have an answer for that. It's right here.
Yep.
To me, at least, the most perverse fact about mass-archies, including protarchies, is simply that the first distortion they bring their residents to believe, whether by education or by compulsion, is that mass-archy is the optimal form of government. A mass-archy which fails in this task is not stable. It remains, after all, a mass-archy, and its residents will terminate it. We have yet to demonstrate that this mass-archy thing is the form of government that most of us were brought up to call democracy, but this post is getting long, and perhaps readers will find the point obvious and uncontroversial. If not, I hope they will say so. So I think the only thing interesting here is that he's basically using Plato's Republic.
Yeah. I mean, mass-archy is implicit in neocameralism. Because, look, if the success of a sov-corps depends on residents living there and maximize revenue, then all the residents have to do is form a consumer union and say, listen, we'll agree to act as a certain block, right? And if you don't give us X, Y, or Z and make us mad as a block, we've all promised to go move to other sov-corps.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as a block, we can advertise to get more consumers for you, helping your profits. But right, and so now what's going to happen? Now you're going to have different blocks rising up that are consumer blocks, and the consumer block with the most influence is going to have the most influence over corporate policy because it'll have the bigger threat over profits. Bada bing, bada boom. Democracy's back, boys. It's back on the menu. Like, nothing he's done has even solved the problem.
But, well, what even is a democracy? Because at one point he said everything is democracy.
Yeah, basically. But even if we just take it at face value of something like governments capitulating to the largest numbers of mobs to form policy, you can get that immediately from neocameralism because the profits of the literally the purpose of the government to make profits is dependent on the consent of the governed to live there, pay rent, and give revenues to the corporations. And so it's basically just government exists due to the will of the governed with extra steps. And the steps aren't even that interesting as far as extra steps go. It's the same thing, ultimately speaking.
Yeah. An explanation of democratic centrism, and just Moldbug, December 27th, 2007. The political belief system of most normal people in the Western world is well described, I think, by the phrase democratic centrism. This belief system is democratic because it assigns unconditional positive valence to the word democracy. A rule of the modern world is that anything which can get away with describing itself as democratic will do so. The fewer Kevin Bacon steps between you and democracy, the better. Granted, I've never seen any breakfast cereal, personal hygiene product, or mobile phone which managed to associate itself with democracy, but I'm sure it's not for lack of trying. For example, most people today would agree with, or at least take no offense at, the suggestion that in a democratic country, it's important for corporations to be socially responsible. Perhaps we can allow this wonderful phrase, socially responsible, to hang in the air for a moment. It certainly has earned its delicious bacony odor of democracy. See, this is what is also tedious about Moldbug. He acts like social responsibility is something foisted on the corporations when they're the ones that gave us DEI, when they're the ones that gave us stakeholder capitalism.
Yes.
This isn't the government forcing it on the corporations. This is the corporation forcing it on the rest of us to make us look the other way because look at us, we're socially responsible.
Exactly. Yep.
Obviously, neither the word democracy nor any of its multitudinous declensions, conjugations, and obfuscations can convey information in any reasonable discussion between civilized and intelligent people. Oh, man. I think if we replace the word democracy with neocameralism and formalism, the meaning of that sentence would be the same.
Mm-hmm.
To define something as democratic is to define it as good, leaving us to face with Hume's ought. The ultimate rhetorical dead end. Man, I love it how this Humean has so many Thomist fanboys. How did he do it?
Carefully.
Dude, like, I mean, you get a Thomist on Hume and he'll just lay into him, but like Moldbug has legions of Thomist supporters.
Because a lot of Thomists are libertarians and they're authoritarians, and so they'll use that about Moldbug to
Oh, we could just forgive the fact that he's a human.
Sure, I mean, everybody's wrong about something.
The only practical use I can imagine for democracy is an ingredient of fun contrarian labels such as anti-democratist. So we are left with centrism. What is centrism, and why do so many people believe in it? A centrist is anyone who believes in the concept of objective public policy. Another way to say this is that a centrist is someone who believes in the science of government. To the centrist, government is not just one thing. It is a kind of metaphysical binary structure. Its staff is divided into two classes, elected officials and career professionals. Or if you prefer to be negative, politicians and bureaucrats. The gap between these tracks is about as bridgeable as the gap between vanilla ice cream and Mongolian beef. And the two have completely separate responsibilities. Elected officials make policy decisions, career professionals set public policy. Isn't this weird? I mean, does anyone who holds any position in this entire system ever stop to think about how bizarre the situation is? If by some wild off chance you ever happen to have been employed in the actual productive economy, you can't imagine working in a company whose organizational hierarchy was divided into political and professional categories. Surely if it was any way to run a railroad, at least one railroad in history would have been run this way. Perhaps one of our readers is familiar with some such animal. If you read the New York Times regularly, man, Logos, he will not get off the New York Times. You will note that the decisions which are driven by politics are often bad ones, whereas policies formulated by experts tend to be good. Isn't this interesting? Is the New York Times generally right about this or generally wrong? Anyway, it's easy to explain why centrism is a fallacy. First, there is no conceivable categorical distinction between political and apolitical actions or decisions. I mean, I just feel like he just defined a term absurdly in order to knock it down. Like, that's not what centrist means politically. It means someone who's between the, quote, extremes of the Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
That's what it means in its colloquial sense.
Yep.
So he's just used that word, defined it in a ridiculous way to then knock it down, but nobody holds to this.
Mm-hmm.
Since the real world cannot be controlled or predicted, since we never step in the same river twice, every decision made by every organization which operates successfully on the real world is a judgment call by definition. You know what else that entails, Logos? That you can't freaking have a computer code mindset to form a government because you never walk in the same river twice.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All decisions are executive and discretionary. In particular, there is no such thing as scientific public policy. Public policy and science have no more in common than lawn tennis and animal husbandry. It is impractical to conduct any controlled experiment on the real world, human or natural. Economic remedies cannot be tested. Diplomatic strategies cannot be modeled. Military tactics cannot be verified. Ecological outcomes cannot be predicted. I mean, that's just total BS. I mean, if military tactics can't be verified, why do people war game? Governments war game, and then and when they have real conflicts, they then adjust. So, at least not in any way that can claim Popperian falsifiability and thus immunity to the tides of groupthink and generally. Wow, Popper now. Man, this guy's on thin ice. Human Popper?
Yep.
Wow. Thomas Bros, Thomas Gang, you gotta ditch this guy. See, Logos, if we can get the Thomas Gang to ditch this guy because he's a human popperin, then that'll be a minor success. And general human folly. Ergo, there's no objective or nonpartisan or apolitical basis for any public policy, even in departments often regarded as scientific. I mean, look, this is just stupid, right? Because by the same token, any sort of long-term planning that a corporation does is impossible for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah.
And nothing the corporation does is scientific, even though, of course, mass production under Taylorism was considered, wait for it, Logos, scientific. So I don't know, why did we even have Taylorism then, Moldbug?
It's a good question.
Perhaps it is possible to define any policy whose motivation does not depend on pseudoscience. Pseudoscience being anything that claims to be science but ain't, as scientific. But this is hardly a high bar, and B yields results with no relationship to the conventional concept of scientific public policy. For example, the absorption spectrum of CO2 is a matter of physics. The concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere is a matter of chemistry. But absent infinite computer time or magic superpowers, the climate sensitivity of the Earth cannot be calculated by any falsifiable procedure. Moreover, it is impossible to construct any conceivable objective conclusion as to why it should be good or bad for Earth, or even just for us poor schmucks who happen to live on it, to be warmer or colder than it is now, whether as a result of geoengineering by CO2 release or aerosol emissions, or variations in solar output or UFO exhaust or whatever. Therefore, climate policy is a value judgment of an unforecastable outcome, and any suggestion that it could be formulated objectively is comic at best. Reasonable people can disagree on the subject and will always be able to. So why is this belief in apolitical government, especially of all things apolitical democracy, so prevalent? There are several interesting answers to this interesting question. You can start by observing that the illusion of objective policy creates an objective center for any system of government built around it. If you are a democratic centrist, you will believe that an intelligent visitor from Saturn, knowing no more and no less about Earth history than we do, would come up with exactly the same structure of government as that we see in Washington today. Perhaps our Saturnian would withdraw from Iraq. Perhaps there would be a few tweaks to energy policy. Perhaps he would revitalize the Department of Health and Human Services with new performance-oriented metrics for a more efficient budget process. But basically, he would look on what he saw and find it good. In other words, his political perspective is essentially that of Dr. Pangloss. Our democratic centrist is no more than a believer in the status quo. Wow, Logos. As if Moldbug isn't a believer in the status quo.
Say again?
I said, as if Moldbug isn't a believer in the status quo.
Yeah, he seems to be a pretty big believer in the status quo.
Oh, yeah. Corporations good. Science good. Religion bad. I mean, this is like the most unimaginative person. I mean, and yet, to the democratic centrist, the burden of proof always rests on whoever disagrees with him. For example, anyone with proof of racial equality should forward it at once to Jim Goad. There is no reason to even bother debating under such conditions. All attempts at rational conversation terminate in the democratic equivalent of, but Brando has electrolytes. The rest of us who do some cosmic computer screw up have retained our commos mentis, can see quite easily that the democratic center is not absolute or objective. Because above all, if it were as absolute or objective, you would kind of expect it would stay in the same place, and it doesn't. In other words, if our Saturnian's political philosophies remained unchanged, he could not be a centrist on his first visit in 1907 and remain a centrist on his second visit in 2007. The centrist ideas of 2007 were held by dangerous extremists in 1907. The centrist politics of 1907 are only held by dangerous extremists in 2007. This does not preclude the possibility that either the 1907 center or the 2007 center is right, but it does preclude the possibility that both are. And they could just as well both be driving away out in head case space. For example, as Peter Hitchens writes in his fascinating, if somewhat mistitled, Brief History of Crime, so before showing that something enormous and damaging has happened to English society since the Second World War, it is worth quoting an astonishing footnote from Jose Harris's Social History of Britain, Before the First World War, Private Lives, Public Spirit, Britain, 1870 to 1914. A very high proportion of Edwardian convicts were imprisoned for offenses that would have been much more lightly treated or wholly disregarded by law enforcement in the late 20th century. In 1912-13, for example, 1/4 of males aged 16 to 21 were imprisoned in the metropolitan area of London, or serving 7-day sentences for offenses which included drunkenness, playing games in the street, riding a bicycle without lights, gaming, obscene language, and sleeping rough. If late 20th century standards of policing and sentencing had been applied in Edwardian Britain, these prisons would have been virtually empty. Conversely, if Edwardian standards were applied in the 1990s, then most of the youth of Britain would be in jail. As it happens, 1913 was a fairly bad year by these standards at the time, with 98,000 serious offenses recorded. This level would not be surpassed again until 1920, when the total rose to 101,000, after a wartime truce, during which annual crime tallies sank to as low as 78,000 in 1915. Even convicts were reported to be showing patriotic zeal as they broke their rocks. Measure this against the figure of 2,521,000 recorded in 1980, and even when you grant that the population has risen from 36 million to 49 million, these figures could be from different planets as well as from different eras. Now, since I'm a child of the late 20th century, the idea of a prison term for saying F you does not strike me as sensible. On the other hand, one can scarcely regard a 2,000% increase in crime as evidence of effective scientific policy. Surely the aficionados of scientific government in 1907 did not preface their promises with the caveat that while the New Jerusalem that was to come would have this and that, and the other thing would also come along with, 20 times as much crime, even setting aside the defining down of crime. Democratic centrism draws a sort of n-dimensional bullseye on public policy space. Everything the state does now, the center of the eye is bipartisan, centrist, apolitical public policy. As we drift away from this magic vortex, our policies become first politicized and radical or extremist. And when we see that this bullseye moves over time, that we have no reason to believe it is in any way correlated with reality, that in fact we have quite a bit of evidence that at least in the past it has been thoroughly delusional, we realize that we are dealing with a very weird, scary thing. Well, something that Moldbug just made up, because that's not the definition of centrists in the current political context. So if we reject the self-framing of democratic centrism, if we refuse to accept this phenomenon on its own terms, we need to find another explanation of movement that is simpler and makes more sense. Democratic centrism exists. It may not tell us anything useful about the world, but it is part of a reality, and its existence at least can be explained. One straightforward question is, where did it come from? In American politics, the concept of centrism dates at least to the Greeleyite liberal Republicans of 1872. It's a little difficult to detect before then. Perhaps there is some Prussian heritage, as many American intellectuals of the period studied in Germany. Perhaps the founding achievement of American democratic centrism was the Pendleton Act of 1883, which ended the spoils system and established a civil service which was effectively independent of a democracy. Politics. So there we go. Schrodinger's democracy logos. Democracy is now just politics.
Mm-hmm.
Another important milestone was Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, 1922, which perhaps best represents the birth of objective journalism, i.e. of our present regime, in which journalists consider themselves civil servants responsible to the public rather than to their readers. But this does not explain why we have democratic centrism rather than nothing, or rather than something else. One interesting clue is that while the center does not appear to remain continuously in the same place, it does not appear to wander unpredictably either. Over the last century, at least, the American political center, and thus the U.S. federal government, has moved in a direction which can be generally described as progressive. There have been occasional mild reversals of the trend, for example, in the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s, but even across these years, we see the secular, no pun intended, curve. The same ideas that were centrist in the 1980s tend to be progressive in the 1950s and radicals in the 1920s. Readers of UR are quite familiar with this trend, but what could explain it? I have taken quite a bit about what happened, but much less about why it happened. First, we should never disregard the possibility that the progressive migration of the center is simply a passage out of darkness and into light, a gradual escape from delusion. This narrative is sometimes described as Whig history. By definition, to be a Whig is to believe in Whig history, and here at UR we do try to respect the reader's beliefs. Moreover, it is easy to see how Whig history could be true. The truth has an obvious advantage over any delusion. Everyone wants to believe the truth. No one wants to be deluded. Perhaps people were deluded in the past and are just now getting over it. If Whig history is true, this does not validate the fallacious Panglossian philosophy of absolute centrism, but it suggests that the center of today just happens to have arrived at an actual perception of reality or is in the process of arriving at it. The latter possibility is especially interesting. It suggests that the interpretation that an accurate view of reality is, if anything, far more progressive than today's worldview. If the casual motor of Whig history is simply best described as progress, there's no reason to believe that this process should stop in the present. Indeed, it would be surprising if the relationship between increasing progressivism and general enlightenment had a non-monotonic maximum precisely at the center point of contemporary American politics. The whole strange journey from Teddy Roosevelt to Nancy Pelosi was as per Pangloss for the best. But as any continuation in Dennis Kucinich land will be a sad story of decline. Is it possible? Sure, but it seems unlikely. So many sensible people have grown up on Whig history, extrapolate logically, and end up as a progressive in today's sense of the word. It's worth noting that my father's parents, who were in fact card-carrying communists, described themselves as progressive for their entire adult life. But there is an alternative to Whig history. There is, I'm not sure that phrase Tory history is much used, but surely it would not displease the likes of Eric von Kuenen-Ledeen. I recommended this book before, but it's been a while. It was really essential reading, although perhaps I should worry that after you read K. All, UR will seem like a cheap plastic imitation. Find a way to convey the gestalt of Tory history to readers in our uber Whiggish age is definitely a beat noir of this blog. I don't believe I've done it. Perhaps it's simply impossible for a modern reader to simply grok Tory history in one tremendous mental flash. However, the possibility is so seductive that I can't stop myself from trying. Well, I know a little bit about who Eric von Kuenen-Ledeen is. I think he was an Austrian Catholic reactionary. And since a lot of Moldbug's arguments are reactionary, I think what he means by Tory history is something along the lines of a secularized update of the traditional Catholic critique of everything after 1517. Which, if that's what he means by this, it's garbage. So we'll have to keep going. One possible flash can be obtained by reading this LA Times article about Vladimir Putin's pet youth group, Nashi. For registration, I use and recommend Bug Me Not. Russia today is actually an independent country, which is pretty cool. I don't get the impression that it's particularly well governed, but it could be a lot worse. Ideally, the mafias which run Russia today will coalesce into a more coherent entity, like the New York mob and more like Singapore or China. And Neocameralism incentives for good government will start to replace the informal incentives for corrupt government. I wouldn't necessarily bet on this happening, but I wouldn't necessarily bet against it either. And Nashi is a fascinating phenomenon. It is best characterized as a pro-government activist group. Somehow members of Nashi manage to be simultaneously rebellious and official. Does this remind you of anything? Anything at all? We have many reasons to be thankful for Russia. Chekhov, Bulgakov, and Brodsky are three. But one good reason to love Russia is that Russian history so often mirrors the political tropes of the West, but in a particularly crude, obvious, and Russian way that makes their true nature especially apparent. From the perspective of Tory history, progressivism is to Nashi, as you and I are to the benthic and vagal California sea hare. Ablisa. Ablisa has something like 10 neurons, each the size of a large asparagus stalk. I exaggerate slightly, but just as Ablisa is the perfect research organism in which to develop a basic understanding of the neuron, Nashi is a perfect way to understand the fascinating phenomena of pro-government activism. It is especially helpful that Nashi, being basically a fascist movement, is aligned directly against Western progressivism. Nashi's perception of the U.S. State Department as its primary natural enemy strikes me as accurate. So, for example, we hear talking to Nashi members offers a sample of the kaleidoscope of fears that swirl in Putin's Russia. An alleged U.S. plot to infiltrate politics, gets hold of the natural resources, and shatter mighty Russia into a smaller, more easily managed countries is a recurring theme. Well, Logos, Nashi wasn't wrong, were they?
Nope.
I mean, so wait, he's reading somebody reporting on Nashi. I mean, what kind of an idiot didn't see this? I don't. Of course, the U.S. is encircling Russia. I mean, it's like, whatever. As a resident of San Francisco, perhaps the world's most progressive city, I find the phrase kaleidoscope of fears quite evocative, especially when it comes to swirling. San Franciscans have no swirling fears at the U.S. State Department, but they certainly compensate in some other departments. Well, you know what I want to know, Logos, right? Since Nashi's a pro-government activism, Moldbug is just the same thing, but for corporations.
Yeah, obviously.
And then we have the money quote. Nashi, the largest and most prominent of the youth groups, is heavily wrapped up in the concept of upward mobility. Many of the youths have been lured to Moscow with promises of yuppie dreams. They view Nashi as an investment in their careers, akin to joining the right fraternity at a U.S. university. Of course, progressivism has nothing at all to do with the upward mobility. The other day was at a Christmas Eve dinner party when all the other guests, except, of course, Mrs. Moldbug, whose agility at Ketman is unrivaled, were hardcore progressives, and someone was wondering out loud how Angelina Jolie manages to be involved in so many good causes, because she's obviously just so shallow. Perhaps it has something to do with her PR people, I suggested. I mean, they're not exactly going to tell her to endorse the Burmese junta for their energetic maintenance of public order, are they? Kettman is not exactly my strong point. I guess I really get the impression that this woman believes supporting progressive causes was some great sacrifice on the part of Brangelina. But why wouldn't she? I'm sure Brad and Angelina believe it as well. Of course, progressives also think of themselves as anything but pro-government. And how is this neat trick accomplished? Welcome to our old friend, objective public policy. Progressives can think of themselves as bravely resisting an oppressive regime because they oppose the Bush administration, which is apolitical, and support the federal civil service, which is professional and scientific. When they think of the government, they think exclusively of the former, which seems to invest a considerable amount of its energy on frustrating the efforts of the latter. Needless to say, there's nothing but a vicious attack on democracy. At a certain point, all you can say is wow. The parallel between Nazi and progressivism gets even tighter when we realize that although progressives are not acting in the service of any present leader whose personality cult can be compared to Putin's, for one thing, you can't really have a personality cult unless you have a personality, which pretty much disqualifies all living American politicians. We get a far better signal when we compare the American past to the Russian present. In case it's not obvious who I'm talking about, try these links 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm just going to open this. All right. Note this is a discrepancy between Wikipedia's versions of the Greer incident and the NS version. According to the NS, the Greer had dropped up charges before the U-boat fired a torpedo. With all due respect to Dr. Goebbels, I think I'll go with Lewicki on this one. But when we look at the overall exchange, I don't think the picture leaves us feeling too good about Whig history. What's astounding about the American side of this exchange, there's nothing surprising in the fact that Nazis have truth on their side, could just stick to it. It's not just the sheer volume of blatantly fraudulent inventions, not just the almost perfect inversion of reality, not just the incredibly crude and paranoid tone of the speech. Doesn't it make Rush Limbaugh sound like Adlai Stevenson? But the fact that the intended audience was the American electorate, and by all historical evidence, this was exactly the sort of material they lapped up. If this period interests you, there is more here. Imagine a Russia 70 years from now in which all significant intellectual movements are descended from Nashi. All leaders, all teachers, professors, journalists grew up on the Nashi definition of reality. For most of them, their parents probably did as well. In fact, the Nashiism of 2007 is remarkably tame compared to the Nashiism of 2077. Anyone in 2077 who even begins to question that Putin saved Russia from disaster at the hands of George Soros and the State Department is simply a nut, a crank, and an extremist. Do I think Nashi and Putinism will actually survive until 2077? Of course not. It's Russia, after all. On the other hand, we still have the New Deal to kick around. I see, this is another thing that's so bizarre about Moldbug. Like, by 2007, all of the New Deal economic regulations had gotten rid of. The big one I remember hearing about was Glass-Steagall.
Glass-Steagall, yep.
What is he talking about? There's no legacy of the New Deal in 2007.
Listen, corporations don't rule the country with an iron fist. It's all the New Deal's fault. Look, we don't have our own death specials running around mowing down unruly workers. I mean, this is clearly the New Deal's fault.
Yeah, there you go. That's the pernicious effects of FDR. So, let's see. So here's our brief explanation of democratic centrism. First, centrism is a misnomer because when we examine the movement over time, we see that it moves gradually in a progressive direction. What we are looking at is democratic progressivism. The center is just the center of its shifting window at the present time. Second, progressivism is a form of pro-government activism. Unlike Nashi, progressivism does not revere any living ruler. Its faith in the state is given entirely to the professional civil service. The mechanism by which it delegates this faith is the strange concept of apolitical government, which makes about as much sense as a cheeseburger without cheese. Third, democratic progressivism is not democratic in the classic sense of representative democracy, wherein the government is managed by elected politicians, as we've seen. Well, there you go, Logos. So Moldbug knows that democracy as a decision-making process is something distinct, not necessarily popular sovereignty. but he's
Right.
intentionally conflating the two throughout most of his work thus far to create confusion. But here he makes the distinction.
Yep. I mean, he knows better, but we've known this.
Yeah, I know. As we've seen, democratic progressives despise politics in all its works, unless, of course, the political process produces leaders who nourish and support the civil service, in which case they are wise and visionary statesmen. The trick is that the progressives are absolutely right about this. Political democracy is a disastrous system, as James Madison wrote. Hence, it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Madison was referring to direct democracy, Athenian style. His judgment of this form was indeed shared by his contemporaries, who could hardly avoid noticing the rather striking connection between the destruction of Athens and its adoption of democracy. But in the rest of Federalist 10, Madison goes on to explain how representative or indirect democracy will not suffer the same consequences. As a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the great number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. You will frequently hear people, often otherwise very perceptive people, telling us that the U.S. is not a democracy but a republic. Next time you hear this, ask the wise sage who is speaking what exactly a republic is. Perhaps he will explain that republic is a form of the Latin res publica, i.e. government. Ask him to give you an example of a government which is not a republic. Perhaps he'll come up with a monarchy. In this case, thank him politely for explaining that the U.S. has no king, ideally without revealing that you knew that already. Here we have it straight from James Madison. A republic is different from a democracy because the former has elected representatives and is bigger. This will have the following effects. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Elected politicians will be wise and noble. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. At least wiser and nobler than the people who elected them. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers or local prejudices or sinister designs may by intrigue or by corruption or by other means first obtain suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. You think? The question resulting is whether smaller or extensive republics... You know what, Logos? Since we got this dumbass here, you know who's going to betray the interests of the people? The CEO of a corporation. How about that?
Easily. Yeah.
This is such a... Wow. The question resulting is whether smaller or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal, and it's clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. Isn't it funny how bigger always turns out to be better? In the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few, and that however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents, and being proportionally greater in the smaller republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option and consequently a greater profitability of fit choice. The more people you have, the more wise and noble people you have. Duh, world elections now. What are we waiting for? In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large, than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried and the suffrages of the people being more free. Will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and most diffusive and established characters. I'm afraid we've learned a lot about the vicious arts since then. Okay. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of a republican than of a democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing the majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable persons, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. If we adopt the Constitution, there will be no national political parties. The country is just too big. Besides, even if there are national parties, they'll be weak and disorganized. Before I continue reading, back to the earlier point Madison makes about larger republics having more people. Yeah, that's why Rome was so successful. Moldbug is an idiot. The reason why Rome was successful and the Greek city-states were not was, wait for it, Logos, Rome had more people to pick from.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know? What do you know, Logos?
Yep.
The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equivalent division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to provide the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular country or district than an entire state. He said Confederacy. So much for little Jimmy Madison's political sage. With geniuses like this, who needs fools? It's obvious why Ron Paul wants to restore the Constitution, because it worked out so well. Well, I mean, I'm really getting tired of this smartass. I mean, Madison is one of the greatest political theorists of all time, and depending on how long you want to say the American experiment lasted, maybe it failed in 1861 when Lincoln centralized the state. Maybe it failed in 1913 with the rise of the Federal Reserve Bank. Moldbug doesn't have anything to point to.
Right.
He doesn't have anything to point to at best. To quote Lincoln, we have 77 years, right? That was the original project.
Mm-hmm.
Then some people think, me included, the warfare state begins with the centralization of power under Lincoln. Or you could argue that it was the banks in 1913. But still, that's more than Moldbug has. As I explained last week, the actual form of government in the U.S. at present is a mass-archy, a state whose legitimacy is dependent on the mass of public support. Democratic centrism is the ideology that legitimizes the state. Of course, one of the main activities of the said state is to teach its free, independent citizens how great democratic centrism is. Everyone loves a self-looking ice cream cone. Electoral politics is quite vestigial in a modern mass-archy. Polling is far more efficient and reliable way to measure support. The EU, in which politics plays an even more negligible part, is a perfect example. It is quite tricky to convince people that they can have a democracy without politics, but most of the work has already been done, and the project is clearly practical. One easy way to understand how the U.S. power structure actually works is to adopt the hypothesis that the strongest institutions are the most stable and permanent. For example, in a conflict between Microsoft and the New York Times, who would win? He's going to tell us that the New York Times would win. He's going to tell us that. One can imagine a situation when the New York Times triumphed and Microsoft was no more. Whereas it is impossible to imagine any force short of the U.S. military if its patience somehow turns out to be less eternal, which could destroy the Times. Where is this coming from, Logos?
Which part exactly?
This whole thing. I mean, Microsoft is a big tech company. Of course it's more powerful than the New York Times. He's being an idiot.
Yep.
People who talk about declining newspapers' revenue have no clue. The New York Times is an NGO, which happens for reasons that are basically historical, to be sponsored by a publishing corporation. If said corporation were to disappear from the face of the earth, and Times reporters had to be supported by grants and foundations like every other NGO in the world, do you really think they'd have trouble raising money? When we forget NGOs, they're called NGOs because of how easy it is to forget that they're not a part of the state. And look only at the U.S. government proper. Stability is easy to find. The civil service and the judiciary cannot be replaced by any force short of God. Ergo, we would expect to see that they have the most power, and I believe this is indeed the case. Well, conspicuous by absence is the Federal Reserve. But oh well.
Mm-hmm.
What remains is largely in the hands of Congress, and it does not distribute evenly across the members of that august body. It is in the hands of the committee staffs and the committee chairman. Congresspersons are technically politicians and can be replaced, but they also have a 98% incumbency rate, and I don't believe this is lower for our committee chairs. Furthermore, when a chair dies or theoretically loses an election, his or her replacement is chosen not by lottery but by seniority, presenting general institutional continuity. By changing the majority party, voters can also replace all the committee chairs in block. This has been known to happen most recently in the 90s. It is the change of party that really shows us how close to the center both Republicans and Democrats are. To judge by their actions, the incentives affecting the Republican Congress did not seem to differ particularly from the incentives affecting the Democratic Congress. I think a few minor programs were abolished or restructured, but I could be wrong. For obvious reasons, voter interest in congressional elections tends to be negligible. In fact, by 19th century standards, voter interest in all elections is negligible. There is simply no modern counterpart to the great mob upheavals that were 19th century elections. Perhaps there has something to do with the depoliticization of government. However, to the extent that the Americans care about elections, at all these days they care about presidential elections. The president is normally the chief executive of the federal government, but a real chief executive controls three levers of management: budget, policy, and personnel. The White House has no budgetary power other than the veto. Domestic policy is generally prescribed by law, or what at least is called law, which is written in very vague terms by Congress and refined by judges and agency experts. Civil servants are completely insulated from political selection or promotion. The White House does select political appointees who are nominally the senior officers in their various departments, but their ability to steer the civil service ship is minimal, and their temptation to go native is unending. As late as the 1860s, as the debate over the Tenure of Office Act shows, the president was believed to have unchallenged power to hire and fire all federal officials. This did not work out well, and it shortly disappeared. Even in the 30s, FDR could promote a political general like George Marshall directly from brigadier to chief of staff. Like so many of FDR's executive decisions, this would be unthinkable today. Presidency is perhaps best compared to the British monarchy as of 100 years ago. It is gradually becoming an entirely symbolic institution. Today, there are clear, substantial exceptions to this pattern, but this pattern is clear. The influence of politics is probably doomed to decrease over time because politics sucks. Electoral politics is a disastrous way to run a railroad. Any politicization of government tends to have immediate negative effects on its performance. Because we know, Logos, you can't politicize corporations.
That's right.
As anyone who calls Sir Humphrey can testify, the permanent government has the motive, the opportunity, and the propensity to exacerbate these effects, and so the cycle continues. So this is what it means to be a democratic centrist. It means you support, cherish, and revel in your loyalty to a permanent government which is immune to electoral politics. Like Mary's little lamb, you follow wherever it goes. Because you're a centrist, you believe the decision of these Beamtenstat are scientific and objective, whereas reality is a bunch of people playing their usual hominid power games. And why is democratic centrism so popular? Because as in Russia, all the state has to do to produce large numbers of young, energetic people to support it is to create a situation in which pro-government activists are more likely to succeed professionally, socially, and financially. Well, Logos, what Moldbug didn't explain is how this got into power, which he said he was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
it takes no effort to explain how it maintains power, but to how it got power. And Moldbug says he's going to do something that doesn't do it. Wow. Imagine that, Logos.
Yeah, it's a norm.
In Russia, its methods are conspiratorial, heavy-handed, and crude. In the West, they are anything but. But perhaps this is a discussion for another week. I hope everyone out there is having a happy winterval. I suppose it behooves me to report that last Thursday, Mrs. Moldbug and I went to City Hall and made it official. This is not really an excuse for the large pile of unanswered email that still towers oppressively over my inbox, or the large number of highly perspicacious comments that deserve a response. But perhaps it will serve as some sort of lame excuse. Well, okay. I mean, I don't know, Logos. That was just a lot to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Moldbug could have said everything in like 3 paragraphs.
Yeah, realistically.
So I don't know. I mean, anything you want to say to wrap this up, to contextualize?
Well, the only thing I can say to tie the two together is that Moldbug is good at explaining how systems perpetuate. He's not very good at explaining how systems are established.
Yep.
I mean, this is so with his comments on neocameralism, as I pointed out in the first essay. He wants to call the, quote, devolutionary systems of neocameralism informal, because it's not clear who's going to take charge and all the rest of it. But when neocameralism first takes effect, it's not clear who's going to have power. It's not clear the shareholders are going to be. It's not clear who the CEO is going to be. It's not clear who buys the stocks, with what currency, who sells to who. Like what's actually producing all of this. And so if you have all these informal accidents of history producing the system, then it's not really formal, is it? And so he just takes that to the other essay, where again he's talking about how centrism manifests continuously in a government, but not really initially in a government. And it's essential to talk about how it manifests initially in a government, because that would turn the whole, this cathedral is a kind of organic, decentralized thing upside down. Because if he has to explain how it is that political centrism gets its start, you're going to have this narrative of government actors manipulating institutional power to kind of create for itself a society in which pro-government stuff is the best outcome for young people. But once he does that, there we go. Now we don't have the cathedral as this complicated organic organization. We have this situation where the government is providing means to extend its own yes men. But wait a minute, corporations could do that too.
Yeah. Yep. Simple as. Well, that's all I got for tonight, everybody. And I don't think we have any relevant comments. No. All right. Well, this is Todd Lewis of the Price of Folly podcast signing off.